He owned towers on 2 continents, a name that made headlines, and a net worth that read like an argument, untouchable, unanswerable. Tonight, beneath the glass of his penthouse, he looked suddenly small, pale in a bath of city light, the heart at his ribs protesting its years of work. Money had bought privacy and influence. It had not bought ease. The life he commanded at a distance had a hollow center he could not fill. Stay until the end, subscribe, like, and turn on notifications. The call with Dr. Alastair Finch had been quick and quietly brutal. Finch was neither theatrical nor evasive. He came with charts folded like confidential notes, with the exact calm of someone trained to translate bad news into timetables and options. "Your arrhythmia is worse," he said, without theatrics. "We can do a procedure, implant the device, or we can manage with medication and monitoring. But you must accept that the unexpected has a way of arriving." Alfred listened to the clinical cadence like a verdict. He had always understood risk as something to be priced, insured, neutralized. Mortality presented no balance sheet. It merely arrived. That afternoon, the penthouse felt too large, its modern art mute against the windows. Alfred Stone walked past a shelf of objects whose provenance he could recite by heart. Commissioned ceramics, lacquer boxes, a small repaired bowl, gold seams running like river maps across white clay. It was a kintsugi bowl, the kind of repair Alfred had once admired for its refusal to pretend at wholeness. He touched the gold line and felt absurdly like he was tracing his own fracture. He did not sleep. He dressed with purpose he had not felt in years. An old coat he could afford to damage, shoes that had seen better days, a cap pulled low. The disguise was small theater, enough to obscure a face, insufficient to dress him as anything other than a man who needed to be anonymous. He left one penthouse door and stepped into a world that had not been curated for him. The chill of Manhattan evening, cabs moving like a river of headlights, a sedan idling at the curb, and then gone. He walked. The gilded scepter lived up to its name. Outside, a brass plaque gleamed. Inside, light softened into a warm lacquer that smelled of butter and lemon zest, voices folded into the careful clink of glass. The room was a choreography of small luxuries, silver, linen, polished wood, where people paid to be seen and paid more to forget. Alfred sat at the corner of the bar, under a lamp that cut a private pool of light, and he watched the room from below. Being unseen made him feel, strangely and for the first time in a long while, like a participant rather than an arbiter. On the other side of that same room moved Sophia Jenkins, with the steady grace of someone who had learned to listen before she spoke. Her apron carried a faint chalk of flour and dust from the studio she visited between shifts. A smudge at its hem told of long days. She kept her hair pinned back, carried the tea tray as if it were fragile history. Graduate school lived in her left pocket, a folded page of notes on kintsugi she had been annotating between customers. At home, her mother watched the slow map of illness across her hands. Bills accumulated like rainwater in the corners. Sophia served with an economy that made room for dignity. Charles glided between tables like a man in full possession of his small fief. He wore the restaurant's uniform as armor and his posture as authority. He was the kind of head waiter who folded status into every syllable and leaned his judgment over his staff like a shadow. Beside him, Mr. Saul Davenport, draped in an acquired wealth that smelled faintly of expensive cologne, held court about mergers and art acquisitions with the bored hunger of those who treat the world as a thing to be collected. Alfred chose a table where he could observe without intruding. He folded his hands around a ceramic cup because it felt human, because the heat was honest and immediate. Sophia approached with the tea service, and, when she slid the saucer toward him, her fingers brushed the rim and left a small trace of warmth. She did not look at his face for long. She took orders in the rhythm of habit. He asked for nothing extravagant, just tea and a quiet meal. He wanted to learn how it felt to be overlooked. The room hummed, a fabric of voices. At one table, the clatter of a celebratory toast rose. At another, a woman laughed in brittle filigree. The staff moved like a well-oiled machine, except for the moments where human fatigue peeked through. A dropped napkin, a misaligned plate. Alfred watched how people were treated by proxy, an assessment in micro-gestures. He catalogued it without cruelty at first, a curious anthropologist. Then, as the evening reached its measured pace, a small thing happened that changed the architecture of the room. A crest, metallic, familiar, a badge stamped with an insignia Alfred knew from his childhood, slipped free from the inside pocket of his coat. It was old, a family emblem he had pocketed years ago for reasons he hardly remembered. The pin fell, a glinting punctuation on the rug. It moved at once from private to public. Sophia saw it before anyone else. The crest's design had a mark she had studied in a late-night article about collectors and artisans, an emblem attached to a patronage foundation that had funded restorations, that had commissioned pieces in the Japanese style she loved. She recognized the tiny maker's mark scratched into the back of the pin, the same signature she had seen in a catalogue that had accompanied an auction. Recognition in her was not a gasp for opportunity. It was a quiet recognition of lineage and craft. Without thinking, without theatrics, she stepped closer, stooped, and in the gravity of that small motion, her body made a bow, the plain, unornamented bow of reverence some of her professors had suggested as homage to the hand that made the object. The gesture was for the crest, for the made thing. It was modest, private. It had nothing to do with deference to a man. Charles saw otherwise. He straightened at the sight, and the room shifted. "A bow?" he said, loud enough for a ripple. His tone carried the particular arrogance of someone who confuses custom for weakness. Davenport's face hardened with comic pleasure. He liked to witness the hierarchy of worship from his table of wealth. "You bow to jewelry, girl? To whatever lost thing he plucked out of his pocket?" There was a snicker, the kind that curdled a room's warmth. Sophia straightened slowly. Her hands were steady. "It's a maker's mark," she said. "A cosi? Her voice clipped. She had not wanted an audience. The phrase was enough to mark her as an intellectual to some and as an annoyance to others. The exchange could have paused there, an awkwardness cleared with the dish, a patron mollified. But Charles had been building his currency with the patrons for years. He had learned that public correction cemented the pecking order. "You don't bow to people here," he said, the words edged. "You serve, you smile, you don't perform that." It was not criticism, it was policing. Davenport, sensing sport, leaned forward, his laughter soft as a blade. "We like our staff useful, not sentimental," he offered, as if generosity were the same thing as contempt. He flicked his finger toward Sophia in a mock dismissal. Alfred watched the scene contract into something colder than he had anticipated. He had come to be invisible. He had not expected his small private emblem to become an accusation against someone else. The pen, once a relic in his pocket, had become a loaded symbol in someone else's theater. Sophia's face did not flare with indignation. She looked at the crest in her hand, then at Alfred. There was a pause long enough for the room to smell of lemon and roasted meat and the electricity of judgment. She placed the crest back upon his coat with careful hands. It was an act that could have been read as servile. She meant it as respect for craft and the life of objects. In that moment, she bowed again. This time, the bow folded less into cultural ritual and more into a wordless defense of gentleness. It was small. It was exact. It was, for Alfred, an incision into the narrative he had been breathing. Power declared through deference. "You're dismissed," he said, as if the word could clip away a life with the edge of his syllable. The words landed like a physical thing. Sophia's hands hesitated on the tray. For a breath she was 2 rooms at once, the gilded scepter and the cramped kitchen she left behind where her mother sat by the window and the radiator, where bills lived like small animals in shoeboxes. To be fired from one night's wage could unthread lives. She inhaled the scent of tea and lemon rind and tasted in it the narrowness of choice. "Please," she breathed, speaking not to Charles alone, but to the assembly of people who lent their eyes as if permission to judge were a civic duty. Davenport clapped his hands together like an audience giving a standing ovation to its own cruelty. "She bows to something she doesn't understand," he said. "Such theatrics! If you're interested in the culture of the place, miss," he aimed the remark like a coin, "we ask for professionalism, not eccentricity." There was a hum in the room, forks resting, a server's shoes whispering, a chandelier translating light into dust. Alfred felt something in him tighten, then snap. He had come to learn the world from below. He had not come to be complicit in another's humiliation. For a long time he had outsourced cruelty to policy and corporate memos, dismissals by a number on a page. But now he watched it happen up close, and it tasted like acid. He stood. The chair scraped like a voice. He let the room turn toward him with the slow appreciation of attention that follows a gesture from a stranger. He removed his cap, then his makeshift coat, unbuttoning the cheap garment with hands that had not been used for such deliberate unmasking in public for years. His hair, the face under the cap, those things belonged to news clips and podiums, to a name that bent markets. He placed the rolled coat over his arm and spoke simply. "My name is Alfred Stone." A lull swallowed the patter of cutlery. Some people laughed at first, certain it was a performance. Others sat very still. Davenport's smirk thinned into a measuring look. Charles's jaw hardened like a gate coming to rest. "You've made a mistake," Charles said, the words a reed, sharp, brittle. He had relied on the assumption that wealth is a shield or a whip. "We can't—" Alfred did not wait for argument. He reached into his pocket, produced a phone, no luxury for show, just a tool, and tapped a contact. "Marcus," he said, into the receiver when it connected. "Listen, come down, now." His voice was the one that moved banks into silence, but the urgency in it was different, not corporate, not capital. It carried a human insistence. There are people who think a boss's power is a matter of numbers. Alfred's power was that and more. Marcus Peterson appeared within minutes, as if summoned by a machine of efficiency that the company kept humming in the wings. Peterson's face carried the calm of an executor. He had been Alfred's right hand for years, and now he carried the burden of implementing a decision on the ground. Marcus listened while Alfred outlined what he had seen. "We will handle it," he said, and he moved with procedural speed. Security approached Charles with a clipboard. Marcus's whisper into his earpiece determined the next minutes. Davenport's membership privileges were frozen pending review. Charles was escorted discreetly to a small office where the building's HR awaiting levers of corporate language. It was not theatrical. It was precise. A man who had been permitted to eclipse the dignity of others in a private theater found his privileges mapped and revoked by a single phone call. There would be statements and HR forms, letters with signatures, terms like conduct and code of service, and immediate termination. The gilded scepter, a temple of curated civility, had to be cleaned of the stain of cruelty. Sophia was reeling. She stayed standing, hands empty, her tray abandoned on the floor like a small surrender. "I didn't," she started to say. Then she realized she did not have to explain the thing she had done. A bow, a reverence. Her action was its own truth. Alfred moved to her. Up close he saw the small scar on her thumb, the faint ink on the page of notes she had tucked into her apron. Up close he saw fatigue mapping her cheekbones. The public scene had lodged something in him that is rarely lodged in the spaces of influence. Recognition of another person's particular weight. "You shouldn't have been fired," he said. His voice was quiet enough that those near them couldn't hear the exact syllables. "I'm sorry for that." She blinked in confusion and relief. "Sir?" "Alfred," he interrupted, with a curt smallness of smile. He had been testing a hypothesis about himself and the world. The test had delivered more than facts. It had given him the taste of shame. Marcus approached with the efficiency of a man who knew how to transform decision into action. "Mr. Stone, we've secured the situation. Davenport's privileges are suspended. Charles has been removed pending termination. We'll handle statements, counsel the staff." Alfred let the words wash over him. He could have stopped there, protected himself from further entanglement, and returned to his tower to review memos. Instead, he felt an old impulse, the one that had led him in his early days to fund restorations, to buy works not merely as investments, but as bets on the persistence of craft. His wealth had been a series of transactions. He wanted this moment to be more than another ledger entry. "Bring her to my office," he said to Marcus, "after her shift. We will talk." That afternoon, in the back office, Alfred learned more of Sophia than he would have seen in a year of press conferences. She told him about her research into kintsugi, how Japanese potters repaired broken ceramics with gold lacquer, making the wounds part of the object's history, not erasing them. She spoke not as a student showing off knowledge, but as someone carrying belief. That repair can be beautiful, and that value accrues to those who acknowledge fracture rather than hide it. She told him of her mother, of the days when the house was bright with the small rituals of care, and the days when it was a map of appointments and co-payments. She did not ask for charity. She described evenings where she read in the glow of a desk lamp, annotating lectures on the philosophy of repair, wondering whether objects could teach humans anything about mending. Alfred listened. The facts of her life were narrow. Bills, study, a job that required kindness in measured amounts. They were also vast, a craving to be seen for who she was, and not for what she could perform. Her bow, he realized, had been a measure of respect for a lineage of craft, not a plea for favor. He had not seen the difference until it had been translated into accusation. He offered her a cup of tea in his office, real, not the staged decanters of PR. He poured and watched the steam. "Tell me about that bowl with the gold lines," he said. "Why does it matter to you?" She spoke about the honesty of repair, about how kintsugi treated fractures as history, and how sometimes a sklar, if acknowledged and honored, could be more instructive than a patch of seamless imitation. Her voice threaded through the quiet room, and Alfred felt in it an answer to a private question he had not yet named. What would it mean to be repaired rather than concealed? "You're not offering me charity," she said, wary. "If you're offering that, say it plainly." "I'm offering you something more blunt," he replied. "A job. Help me rebuild the collection with a curatorial integrity I've neglected. A position where you'd have resources, autonomy, and a platform. And coverage for your mother's medical expenses. Immediate. No red tape. Marcus will set it up." The offer carried weight and contours. Director of the Ethelred Collection. That name itself was not vanity, but function. He wanted someone to lead the restoration and stewardship of a collection that had become a monument to his own taste, and, he admitted privately to himself, to his neglect. He had bought art to prove ownership. Perhaps now someone could shepherd it toward meaning. She was careful, as she had been in the restaurant. She tested the edges. "I don't want your pity," she said. "I want honesty, and I want to keep teaching. I want to keep studying." "Then keep both," Alfred said. "I'll fund your thesis if you accept the job. We will pay the medical bills in full. You'll be given authority to commission restorations and to reframe the pieces so they speak of repair, not merely of price." Marcus drafted the first emails that night. He arranged for a preliminary contract to be ready, contingencies filed, a payment plan routed to Sophia's mother's health care. He moved like a man who could translate intent into system. The company would take public responsibility. PR would be careful not to make Sophia a trophy. Alfred did not want spectacle for itself. He wanted the moral architecture of his holdings to be changed. News traveled. Davenport's name appeared in a terse release. Charles's employment was terminated. The restaurant's management issued a formal apology for the staff's treatment. The Gilded Scepter scrubbed itself, as restaurants do, by redirecting narrative. But the deeper change was quieter. Alfred changed a monthly report that used to list acquisitions and profits. He added a line item titled Conservation and Community Engagement. It was a small bureaucratic motion, but to him it felt like a lever. There was more to be done. The revelation of his identity at the restaurant was a spectacle by necessity, and he felt the public aspects of control as both tool and trap. He had made choices that reverberated in staff meetings and in a kitchen where people feared for their paychecks. To be human in a public way was to risk complicating other people's survival. He had to reconcile rescue with responsibility. He wrote to his board that night with the awkwardness of someone drafting both apology and policy. He proposed an audit of employee grievance procedures, a fund for staff emergencies, and a partnership with local community colleges for training programs. He wanted the company to look outward in ways that did not merely purchase goodwill. Marcus, who had long argued for the pragmatic expansion of such programs, translated the vision into feasibility and cost projections with brisk competence. Sophia visited the penthouse in the gray light of an office morning to come. Alfred showed her the shelves where objects waited in stasis, waiting to be seen for more than their price tags. He showed her the kintsugi bowl, and, as if in emulation of its history, he placed in her hands a small object, the crest that had fallen on the restaurant rug. It had been cleaned and put on a small card. He had had it restored, not to hide its patina, but to left its history legible. "This is not for you to worship," he said gently. "It's for you to tell to others the story of mending. If you accept, you won't wear this as a sign of favor. You'll use it to remind yourself how people and objects carry histories." She laughed, a small sound that had no theater. "I don't need jewelry to do that," she said, "but thank you." Alfred stood at the window and watched the city spool its light. He thought, not for the first time, about the bowl's gold seams, and how they didn't erase the fracture, they made it legible. He imagined a collection reframed, where broken pieces were not shuffled to the back, but put forward as narratives of survival. Perhaps, he thought, he could practice that same honesty, his own public mending. The press, hungry for narratives of repentance and redemption, labeled the episode a humbling moment. Columnists wrote about the billionaire who ate anonymously and then reclaimed his moral compass with a phone call. They simplified. They sold headlines. Alfred tolerated it. He had wanted nothing from headlines. He had wanted change. For Sophia, the offer changed the immediate geometry of her days. The possibility of a steady paycheck, a schedule that allowed her to finish chapters between meetings, and the knowledge that her mother's bills would be met. She accepted with the deliberation of someone who had learned to measure promises by practicality and not by flourish. Marcus handed her the initial paperwork with the soft professionalism of a man who could see the stakes for both of them. When the day came to sign, Alfred had one more thing to do. He retrieved from a case a small ceramic bowl he had purchased years ago and had kept because it reminded him of a teacher's phrase. The thing that is broken, repaired well, teaches more than the thing that was never broken. The bowl bore gold seams like a map. He placed it before Sophia, and then, in a gesture that was half ritual and half confession, he set down beside it the crest. No fanfare, just objects placed in a shared field of meaning. "Take that bowl," he said, "and when you restore things, restore them without pretending there was never a break. Make the repair visible. If we are going to change how we keep our collection, let it begin with honesty." She looked at the bowl, the crest, then at him. "That's exactly what I want to show," she said. "How mending teaches us to respect what's been through." Outside, a delivery truck threaded past. Inside, the two sat amid objects and contracts, poring over catalogs and schedules. Alfred realized that the act of restitution was not a single administration of resources. It was labor, it was humility, and it required that he step away from the safety of directives and into the difficult human work of listening and choosing. There would be more challenges, board members skeptical of cost, patrons who preferred status quo, staff who needed more than a single act of enforcement to trust in the system. There would be budget meetings and arguments about language and the fatigue of sustained change. Yet that night, the fundamental structural possibility had shifted. A woman who had bowed out of reverence for craft now had the authority to shape how the collection would speak. A man who had built his life on accumulation had moved awkwardly and belatedly toward the work of mending. They stood in the foyer together as a car idled outside. Sophia with a small satchel, Alfred with a company card in his wallet and a schedule in his head. He watched her step toward the curb, toward a future less precarious than the morning before. On a winter afternoon, months after the restaurant incident, Alfred walked the museum's new gallery with Sophia at his side. They paused before a display that featured the kintsugi bowl, now framed with its restoration notes. A small plaque read, simply and plainly, about the method and the philosophy. Visitors read, then lingered. A child pressed a finger to the glass as if testing the bowl's mapped seams. Alfred felt a small, honest pride, one that was not reducible to net worth. Sophia watched the visitors. Her mother, sitting in a nearby bench because the new space was accessible and had been fitted with care, smiled. Alfred had set up the medical coverage as promised. The immediate terror of unpaid bills had folded into manageable nights. The bowl had become a lesson that extended beyond ceramic and into everyday ethics. At the museum's end-of-year report, Alfred read the line item he had once thought trivial but now regarded as central: curation for community and care. The numbers of visitors who had come because the museum had reframed its philosophy were not astronomical, but the stories they came with were. People wrote about how a repaired object told them permission to accept their own scars. People wrote to say they had forgiven someone or themselves after seeing that mending could be public and honest. Alfred's arrhythmia remained a fragile presence in the background, a reminder that agency has a time frame and choices should not be postponed. He scheduled the implant procedure with a kind of weary acceptance. He took comfort not in the machine, but in the small human commitments he had made in its shadow. Payroll that protected staff, a woman who had been given dignity and authority, a collection reframed to honor brokenness. When he finally sat in the hospital waiting room, he read a letter from a museum visitor who had written to thank Sophia for a program that taught teens how to restore objects rather than discard them.
The letter spoke of how the kids had learned patience and the discipline of care. He found in it an echo of the knight in the gilded scepter, the pin on the rug, the bow, the choice to step into intimacy with consequence. He thought of Charles and Davenport, now names in a file of personnel actions and revoked memberships. He thought of the restaurant and its staff, a place where the hum of service continued, but where procedures had been rewritten and new training scheduled. He thought of Marcus, quietly persistent, who translated moral choices into executable plans. He thought of Sophia, who had taken an offer and transformed it into movement. Outside the penthouse, the city moved without pause. Inside, there were objects mended and people trying to be better. Alfred picked up the kintsugi bowl from the shelf one more time, ran a finger along the gold seam, and felt the lift of something that was not rescue, but responsibility fulfilled in small acts. He had not negated his past.
He had, he hoped, learned to live inside it with repair as method rather than shame as cloak. Months later, at a small event in the museum's new gallery, a professor of art came to speak about the philosophy of repair. In his prepared remarks, he referenced the bowl and the ethical possibility it represented. He did not make the evening about a billionaire's change of heart. Instead, he framed it as a public conversation about the texture of good choices. Sophia moderated the Q&A with practiced calm, asking questions that made people uncomfortable in salutary ways. Visitors left carrying new ideas on how to live with fractures. The surprise that had begun in a restaurant corner, the simplicity of a bow, did more than revise a public man's calendar. It rerouted resources toward the vulnerable. It demanded accountability, and it created a small architecture of repair that stretched from a museum wall into the lives of those who had been disregarded. The act of a waitress, performed without majesty and offered without calculation, had opened a door where the language of dignity could be heard. Alfred stood by the window that night and watched the river of headlights again. He no longer wanted to be only a figure in the papers. He wanted, privately and publicly, to steward the life he had been given with evidence of humility. The crest on his desk was no reminder of lineage, but a token of a lesson learned, that wealth without repair is brittle, and that when something breaks, the honor is in the visible work of fixing it. Sophia's acceptance of the role had not been an instantaneous redemptive arc. It was careful, bureaucratic at times, full of meetings and awkward negotiations. But in the months that followed, she forged programs that anchored repair in practice. Apprenticeships for restorers from underserved neighborhoods, emergency funds for museum staff, and public programs that insisted on the language of mending. The museum became, in small pockets, an engine for reparation and respect rather than a repository for trophies. They continued to argue about budgets, about priorities, about language. Those arguments were not failures. They were the necessary friction of change. Alfred found that being corrected publicly was one of the hardest tasks of all. It humiliated him in a salutary way, stripped of automatic deference. He learned to accept being wrong and to adjust his course. When the company published its annual report the following year, the foreword was not a chest-thumping account of market dominance. Instead, it acknowledged missteps and listed specific commitments to staff welfare and community partnership. The headlines called it a pivot, but the real work was quiet and often unnoticed. A counseling service funded for frontline staff, a transparent complaints process, a well-funded conservation program that prioritized education and access. And, in a modest room in the museum, the kintsugi bowl sat beneath soft light. People paused there. A teen touched the museum-guarded rope and read the note on repair. A woman who had brought an old cracked teacup in asked about programs and left with a card. Little by little, the philosophy spread beyond the gallery into kitchens and homes and the way people spoke to each other. Alfred's life had been altered by a small public moment. by the sight of a waitress bowing to a maker's mark, and by his own decision to be present to what that bow revealed. He had the power to make material change, and he used it. But he had also learned that power without listening is at best decoration. The surprised, almost accidental intersection of their lives had more ripples ahead. New policies had to be defended, more people needed to be heard, and sometimes the old instincts of deference returned in unexpected places. Yet the architecture of repair, literal and moral, had been built, and it had a name now in the museum program: visible mending. On a clear morning, months after the first encounter, Sophia walked through the restored gallery with a workshop full of young restorers. She explained the philosophy of kintsugi, showed them how to mix the lacquer, how to accept fracture as history. She told them simply that repair is not a cover-up but an honor. Her voice carried the authority that happens when words are backed by action. Alfreds watched from the back of the room that day, an observer, now more comfortable with being observed. When the session ended, he approached, applauded quietly, and handed Sophia an envelope. Not a check, but a promise. Funds allocated to a new apprenticeship program named for the ethos she had helped cultivate. She accepted it with a steady hand. Outside, the city moved as it always did, impatient, indifferent, full of its own dramas. But inside that gallery, among chipped porcelain and gold seams, something had shifted. A new liturgy of care, a practice that required attention and time. It was not dramatic in headlines, but it was durable. Alfred would still have to navigate cardiac checkups, board politics, and the occasional misstep of public perception. Sophia would still ferry tea, review invoices, and teach students to treat mending with reverence. They both carried scars and maps of how to live with them. The moment that had begun as a surprising small gesture, a bow, remained surprising not because of its spectacle, but because of its ripple. The way a single public act of respect, seen clearly and not misread as servility, could set in motion a sustained change of heart and policy. People would remember the headlines. Fewer would remember the months of paperwork and meetings and the quiet mercy of paying a bill on time. But those were the things that mattered. They had made a promise to each other and to the community, to keep the seams visible, to teach repair rather than erase fracture, and to be accountable when power was misused. The crest rested now in a drawer labeled for use, not display. When he glued the first gold line into the ceramic of his mother's old sugar bowl, he wept in the quiet of the workshop. The others did not ask why. They had all come carrying small griefs under their arms. The program's other important work was less visible. The museum's complaints office, once a place of defensive forms and oblique memos, had been reorganized into a listening center. People could request mediated conversations with staff. There were facilitated sessions where a volunteer advocate would sit between an upset donor and a curator, naming what was at stake in plain language. Not all conflicts resolved swiftly. Some took months of patient negotiation, of follow-up emails and invitations. But the pattern of response changed. The archive of grievances became a resource rather than a liability, a ledger of wounds open to remedy. A test came sooner than anyone had hoped. A donor, habitually generous but impatient with what he called publicizing mistakes, wrote an op-ed in a glossy magazine questioning the museum's new priorities. He framed the Visible Mending Project as a PR stunt that risked alienating the sort of benefactors the institution needed. The piece was polished and persuasive. It landed like a stone in the museum's placid pond. Board members called an emergency meeting. Old arguments returned about reputation, about the bottom line, about whether the museum's mission should be primarily scholarship and acquisition rather than community work. Alfred sat at the long table and felt the familiar tug of defensiveness rise in him.
He had spent years learning how not to let that reflex rule him. He had also learned to speak when the stakes were ethical. He did not reply with a flourish. He told the board plainly about Thalia's sugar bowl and Jonah's hands. He read aloud a letter from a teacher who had brought a class of students to the gallery and watched them stand silent before the bowl. They asked about the seam the teacher had written. They asked why it was gold. One child said, "It shows the thing learned how to be brave." There were murmurs. A longtime trustee who believed art should be insulated from civic messiness argued that museums endured because they were unassailable spaces of beauty. Alfred listened, then said, "Beauty is not fragile in sanctuary. It is fragile everywhere. What we do here, the repairs, the reparations, saves not only objects, but the possibility that people can be made dignified again." The vote was narrow, but it held. The policy was defended, not because the museum promised perfection, but because it promised a form of accountability that could withstand critique. The visible seams were not a marketing line. They were a commitment.
The critic's article wound through the city for a week, then gave way to another story. A local school had integrated visible mending into its arts curriculum. A senior center had started weekly repair circles. A courtroom probation program had begun a pilot where offenders learned restoration as part of reparation. The practice sprouted in unlikely places. A small cafe started offering discounts to customers who brought broken mugs for repair. A public radio host devoted an hour to talking about the ethics of repair. Each of these initiatives bore the museum's name lightly, but they took on lives of their own. Alfred found himself increasingly present in small ways he had not planned. He attended one apprentice critique and watched Jonah, now steadier, explain how he had rejoined clay with a visible seam that honored the crack's shape rather than erasing it. He visited the repaired teacup that had belonged to a woman who told him, softly, that she finally felt seen when the museum had offered to mend it. He met the waitress, the woman whose beau had begun it all, at a community potluck. She had moved from waitressing to a position at a social services office, a role that let her make steady hours and offered benefits. She told Alfred that she had learned to speak up when people dismissed her. They shared no grand pronouncements. They spoke of small economies, how trust grows when agreements are kept, how dignity returns when gestures of respect are public and reciprocal. Sometimes Alfred's mortality edged back into conversation. During a checkup, the cardiologist had been kind but direct. Continue the medications, moderate exertion, make time for rest. Alfred wrote the recommendations in his neat hand and folded the paper into a drawer with the crest. The body imposed boundaries. The project had taught him to listen to them as another kind of seam. He began, reluctantly, to let others lead on things he had once insisted on managing. He let Sophia take more of the day-to-day, and she, in turn, learned the nuance of asking him when he wanted to be asked and when he needed to be led. One afternoon in late spring, the museum hosted an informal open day. People were invited to bring objects to be mended and to watch apprentices at work. The room filled with the low, concentrated noise of hands and tools, the small conversations of people reconnecting with the things they loved. A child brought a wooden airplane, one wing glued at an odd angle. Her father watched as Sophia and Jonah adjusted the joint and soldered a gold thread into the seam, explaining in a few simple sentences why they didn't hide the repair. When the child held the plane up, the wing gleamed. She ran it across the gallery floor and then suddenly returned and placed the plane in Alfred's hands. He felt the lightness of it, its modest weight. He looked at the gold seam and then at the girl. "Keep it," she said, "so it remembers." He understood what she meant.
The visible seam did not pretend absence.
It kept memory in place and made of memory a new kind of beauty. Alfred left the gallery that day with a card in his pocket, another note of thanks, and the sense that the work would outlast any of them because it had woven itself into the city's fabric. Back in the workshop, Sophia sat at a small table with a shard of porcelain and a fine brush. Her hands moved the way hands do when practice makes them kind. Alfred paused at the doorway and watched, thinking of the seasons between crisis and repair. She looked up, and for a brief moment their separate maps of scars and care aligned. No promises, only the patient keeping of a task that mattered. Outside the museum, the city went on, indifferent and insistent. But within a few rooms, under soft lights and among gold seams, people passed along a different rhythm. A rhythm of attention, of listening, of making visible what had been broken so it could be honored. The wave their small bow had started did not feel like victory. It felt instead like a long, quiet craft, an art of living with fractures that required both humility and a willingness to be changed. Alfred set his hand on the case once more, then turned away to join a line of visitors who had come to learn how to mix lacquer, how to hold a seam like a truth. He had taught them, in other ways, that power without listening was at best decoration. Now, in the simple work of repair, he learned the deeper lesson, that repair asks not only for skill, but for faith, that a life, like an object, can be made whole in the visible honor of its scars. The apprentices worked, the visitors watched, and somewhere beyond the walls, the city kept on living, taking what it could from the small, steady transformations happening inside.